Yeah, my name's John Howard. I was born in 1942 on the eastern shore of Maryland, and from the time I was about 7 or 8 years old, I wanted to be a soldier. Initially, I wanted to be a garbage man, but I outgrew that desire and decided to be a soldier. And I was fortunate enough to get an appointment to West Point in the summer of 1960 when I graduated from high school. And then I went to the U.S. Military Academy and graduated 4 years later with the class of 1964. Now, Vietnam was just a little blip on the radar screen in 1964. But as time went on, the commitment came to that U.S. forces would be entered in Vietnam. And of course, having just graduated from West Point, we were at the top of the list to go. So of the 565 men in the class of 1964, I think 98% of us went to Vietnam and served there.
Was this right after you graduated, you went to Vietnam?
I was there. I graduated in June of 1964, and I was in Vietnam 1 year later. And I was asked one time about political affiliations, and I said, well, I was a registered Democrat in 1964 and I voted in that presidential election, and I voted for Lyndon Johnson because he said, I'm not going to send American boys 11,000 miles away to fight in a war that Asian boys should be fighting. And he was inaugurated in January of 1965, and in June of 1965, I was on an airplane headed to Vietnam. And I changed my political affiliation after that. So I went to Vietnam. I was in the 101st Airborne Division. And the 101st Airborne Division was designated to send a brigade to Vietnam. I think the 3rd U.S. Army unit to go in part of the buildup. Because we started building up in March of 65. The Marines sent a regimental combat team in to the northern part of South Vietnam, and then that was followed up with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division, 1st Brigade 101st Airborne Division, which I was part of, and then the 1st Cavalry Division followed up in late September, early October of 65. I went over. I was fortunate that I trained with the same unit that I was with in combat. So I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky from January of 65 until June when I went to Vietnam, and took the same platoon in Vietnam that I had trained with in the United States. And I was very, very fortunate because I served under some really excellent leaders. And I served with some great non-commissioned officers. NCOs, we call them sergeants, who taught me both in Vietnam and at Fort Campbell one hell of a lot about soldiering. And like I said, I was privileged to serve under some great officers, and probably that first tour in Vietnam when I was a platoon leader, 2 different platoons, one the rifle platoon that I trained and the other a reconnaissance platoon, and I served with them for a year. And right at the end of my tour I got sick. I was going to extend for another 6 months because my mentor, Major David Hackworth, the most fearless man I've ever served with and highly decorated, direct commission in the Korean War. But Dave Hackworth said, we'll make you a company commander if you extend. So I extended, and then I came down with malaria and was sent home and was hospitalized for about 4 or 5 months. But in Vietnam, I found my calling. And I was always a tall, skinny guy with glasses. and, didn't play football in high school because I wasn't that good. And, always wanted to be an athlete and always fell short of that expectation. But I found in Vietnam, I found something that I did better than most. So that's the reason I stayed in the Army and made the Army a career. But that was also a blessing because I was insulated from the anti-war fervor that happened started in 67, and many soldiers, particularly those who came back and got out of the military, were treated almost as pariahs. It was a sad day, and I'm not the originator of this quote, but I think many of my fellow veterans from the Vietnam War would say we served our country better than our country served us. That will never happen. I have subsequently had the chance to say we paid an invoice, which our country will never do that again to the soldiers. And you can see the people who returned from Desert Storm, the people who returned from Iraq and Afghanistan. And by the way, my wife is a retired Army officer. She's a veteran of Iraq. So the government looked out a hell of a lot better than they did for the Vietnam veterans. And that's kind of been in my crawl over the years.
Going back a bit, what was it like when you first got to Vietnam? This was towards the beginning of the U.S. involvement. What was that like when you were...
It was at the very beginning, and we had had virtually no counterinsurgency training. We were still with a conventional mindset. And we were, the 1st Brigade, 101st at that time was a paratrooper division. And, we had some great NCOs, veterans of World War II, veterans of Korea, and some of the young soldiers were tough as nails. They were either brought up on the mean streets of, urban America or in hard scrabble rural areas, but they were great soldiers. And, I've kept up with those guys who I went to Vietnam with. Most of them have passed on. There's still a few where I'm not the last man standing yet, but we were trained in conventional warfare tactics. And as a consequence, we were not as focused on winning the hearts and minds of the people that you're supposed to, one of the premises of counterinsurgency. So that was one of the problems. But I will say that whenever we fought them, we gave as good or better than we got.
Tell me about your job. You're a platoon leader when you got there, or just later on?
I was a platoon leader when I got there, and then I became a platoon leader of a reconnaissance platoon, and it was called the Tiger Force. And it was developed by Major David Hackworth, the fellow I mentioned, who was my mentor. And we did a lot of patrolling, and we, often had meeting engagements with the VC, Viet Cong. And generally they fought us when it was to their advantage, and like if we would come upon a fortified position. And we did that more often than not. So.
What was your first taste of combat like?
My first incident in combat, it's one I've talked about. I talked about in the book that I gave you a copy of. We were patrolling and we heard voices. And we were in the midst of a monsoon deluge. We heard voices, point man stopped, and when you're moving in a formation, you have the first man out, the tip of the spear, in other words. And he gave the thing to halt, and he came back and whispered to me. He said, "There's somebody up here. I hear them." So he and I crawled up, and we could hear voices. They weren't U.S. voices. And you're always worried about, when you're a leader of a small unit, that you're going to run into another U.S. unit and get in a firefight, you know, get in a fratricide event with them. But we didn't do that. I heard voices, they were foreign voices, so I swung the platoon around so our firepower was maximized, and we took them under fire. And when the firing all ceased, I threw a grenade. That was our signal to initiate firing. It was a group of montagnards, mountain people, who just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And I always said, never again would I ever engage the enemy without personally seeing who I was fighting. And we killed women and children that day. And it stuck with me, and it was a terrible mistake, but it could have been, you know, could have been an armed North Vietnamese or Viet Cong unit. But it was a terrible thing to bear, and I still bear it today.
This war is not a conventional war, as you mentioned earlier. Was there any other incidents where you didn't know who was Viet Cong, they were a civilian, they were North Vietnamese Army?
Generally, when you get shot at, that becomes a very minor point. You know, when somebody opens fire on you. Now, I will tell you, on my second tour in Vietnam, 72, 73, when the war was winding down and there were no U.S. troops there except advisors on the ground and U.S. aviators, that was a conventional warfare, because the North Vietnamese came across with 14 divisions, lots of tanks, heavy artillery, and that was a knockdown, drag-out fight. And I'm alive today because, and my friend Pete Green, I've never had a chance to tell him that, but I'm alive today because of the U.S. Air Force. I was a battalion advisor, and President Nixon, while he didn't reintroduce U.S. forces to meet that threat, he reinforced the theater with great air power. B-52s, fighters, and so we held off the North Vietnamese. I was with the Vietnamese Airborne unit, the Vietnamese Airborne Division, by having air power, and we smoked them.
Let's compare your first tour to your second tour.
Well, as I was saying, one was an insurgent warfare, the other was a conventional war. The North Vietnamese figured out, and it was led by the Communist Party Secretary Lee Xuan, that it was time to go for broke. The U.S. was withdrawing forces. We had like 60,000 Americans in 1972 when that was initiated, down from a high of over 500,000 Americans on the ground in Vietnam in 1968. And so the North Vietnamese thought this was the time to go for broke. They could overthrow the Thu government, President Thu, and the South Vietnamese government, could embarrass President Nixon, and they also learned a lesson in March of 1968 after the Tet Offensive, when President Johnson said he would not run again for office. And so, as he called it, that bitch of a war forced him out of office. And so I think the North Vietnamese planners kind of knew, because 72 was a presidential election year. And so President Nixon was running again for office, and it turned out that he was running against a man who was going to make peace with the North Vietnamese, Senator George McGovern. That was his opponent. And of course, McGovern lost by a landslide, carrying only one state, the state of Massachusetts, in that election.
So, towards the end of your first tour, you lucky because you had malaria, or did your tour was over, or?
I got malaria when I had 2 weeks left to do. And I got sick, and they medevaced me, and so then I was in the hospital for it was a pretty serious case of malaria.
And then there's a few-year gap between you going back to Vietnam.
Well, I came back to the U.S. and I trained troops. I had a basic training unit for training troops to go to Vietnam. And then that was about a year later. Well, after I got out of the hospital in August, in September, October, I got a call that said, "Hey, Howard, you're going to Korea." Korea at that time was a mess. It was, it was undersupplied, under-resourced, and there was a shooting war going on along the DMZ in Korea. And the North Vietnamese knew that the United States was really focused on Vietnam, so Kim Il-sung figured that was the time to go after, to unify the Koreans, all of the Korean Peninsula. So I was a company commander on the DMZ in Korea, and then after a bad incident, they sent me over to be the operations officer of the battalion that was sort of screwed up. They weren't sort of screwed up, they were.
So was there a lot of skirmishes on the North and South Korean border at that time?
There was a lot of shooting. I think one year, 1967, now it paled in significance to the casualties in Vietnam, but there were 20 or 30 Americans killed in action on the DMZ. Now, the focus of the U.S. Army and the U.S. government was on the war in Vietnam. That was taking all the resources. As a matter of fact, when I found out I was going to go overseas again and go to Korea, I called up the man who assigned me, Major Leon D. Beery, I'll remember it. And I said, "Sir, if it's all the same to you, I'd rather go back to Vietnam than go to Korea." He said, "Hey, Howard, if the Army needed you to go to Vietnam, that's where we'd send you. We need you to go to Korea." And he said, "Do you have any questions?" And I knew that was a rhetorical question. He slammed the phone down. It was not a kinder personnel system at that time.
So after Korea, a bit after Korea, it was going back to Vietnam the second time as an advisor. Can you tell me what being an advisor was really like?
At that time, being an advisor was controlling U.S. air power. And, you were the link between a forward air controller who directed the fighters coming in and the ground. So I gave them a target. The FAC would mark the target, and then the fighters who he was talking on another net to would attack where they, and that's when you wake up, when they wake you up in the morning, or about 3 in the morning, and say, "Tu ta," that was Vietnamese for major, tanks. And you get up out of your foxhole and you look over and there's North Vietnamese tanks coming at you. That'll brighten your day.
Is this when you first started to notice there was now a conventional war?
Oh, we knew it was a conventional war on the 30th of March when they rolled across the DMZ. Then a couple weeks later they hit near Saigon, and then a couple weeks after that they hit the Central Highlands. And I was down fighting the battle near Saigon.
Now at this point, South Vietnam's on the defensive. In the conventional war, you're being practically overrun by...
Damn near overrun.
What was that like?
It was exciting. You had a job to do. You didn't have much time to think about what was going on. And one day that I lost count when the FAC told us that we had worked 100 sets of airs coming in. And it was late in the afternoon, and I went to sleep in the foxhole because I had a sergeant with me, a U.S. sergeant, and I let a cigarette burn through my fingers. I was tired. So it was, like I say, and I can thank the U.S. Air Force for keeping us alive because we almost were overrun. And the Air Force, to their great, great credit, we were being chased by about 80 of us, being chased by a fairly large, probably 300 or 400 North Vietnamese, and the Air Force moved a B-52 strike to come right over them. ruin their day. I wear a patch on my motorcycle vest that says, Vietnam, we were winning when I left. And that may express more pride in service than it did reality. There was a colonel named Harry Summers who, when the ceasefire was signed in Vietnam in January '73, told the North Vietnamese representative on the four-power talks, he said, you know, you never beat us on the battlefield. And the North Vietnamese said, that is true, but it's also irrelevant. So, you know, that was, you know, we were doing what we were supposed to do. It was my job. And at that time, when the ceasefire, we had stopped them. We hadn't regained all the territory, but we had stopped them. And I was part of the task force that was fighting to take the last provincial capital in North Vietnamese hands, Quang Tri City, back, and I was wounded that day on the 26th of July, 1972.
Can you tell me about that day?
We were being relieved by the Vietnamese Airborne Division was being relieved by the Vietnamese Marine Corps. And part of the coordination, I wanted to show this American Marine major where we thought the front line was, the trace. And we were kind of moving, and we were in a city. So you're running between buildings, and I thought I had run into a pole or a wall or something, and a North, whether it was a mortar round or artillery round, hit somewhere fairly close. And I was ahead of the guy, so I was wearing what they call a flak vest, and it was really torn up, but it probably saved my life. And I had some in my face, you know, shrapnel. But I always tell people, I said, I looked like Bradley Cooper before I got wounded, and I look like John Howard now.
What else can you recall about your time being an advisor?
It was a difficult period. I think the the South Vietnamese, our allies, were far more perceptive than we were. And they felt, you could tell there was always the undercurrent that they were going to be left high and dry. That if we could get the prisoners back, our POWs who were up north, released, that we were going to unplug from South Vietnam and never look back. And of course, in 1973, the Congress put an amendment that no aid could go to South Vietnam. And so that's exactly what happened. It was a painful time for those of us who had, you know, lost friends over there, and very painful.
Can you tell me where you were when the U.S. and the North Vietnamese, well, they had not really peace, but you know,
Well, the ceasefire was signed. I was on a fire base, and you know, there was nothing joyful about it. The firing stopped for a little while, but that was only for a day or two. And the main impetus for us to leave was, you know, to get the people who were out with the battalions out of the field, so we didn't have any more casualties. And it was just, you know, it got quiet for a while, but then the way the Paris Peace Accords were set up was where people were located at the time became their territory. So there was a lot of land grabbing back and forth. So there was a shooting war, although we were not involved in it. The U.S. soldiers who were advisors.
Were you there when the U.S. was pulling out?
Yes, I was.
What was that like?
It was kind of bittersweet, because you know, you knew here's something that had been going on since 1965, and here it was 1973, and I wasn't perceptive enough to realize that we probably were going to, you know, sell those folks down the river. And I still keep in touch with my counterpart who I was his advisor the second half of the year. And as a matter of fact, we went to a ceremony, a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House 2 years ago for one of the Vietnamese Airborne Division advisors who got the Medal of Honor, named John Duffy. And Lee Van May and I have, we stay in coordination, you know, ever since. And but I will tell you one thing, that one of the advisors from another unit, we were co-located together. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Butler. He was West Point class of 50, quite a war hero from the Korean War. And he was advising another Vietnamese unit. So our unit was sent on another mission, and we went up and helped break through. We were the first unit to break through the siege to Anlock. And afterwards, we fought our way out of there because we were going to be sent up north to the DMZ. I visited Colonel Butler, and so we shared some cigarettes and BS'd, and I told him, I said, I hope I'll see you later. I left the bunker, and 10 minutes later, an artillery round came through and hit the bunker, probably a North Vietnamese 130 round, and he was killed instantly. And you look back with fate and you say, if those helicopters which were going to pick us up had been delayed for 10 minutes, I'd have been there with him. And that bothered me for a long time. So this colonel who was in that battle told me, we had lunch together in 1974 or 75, and I relayed that to him about Chuck Butler getting killed, and he said, John, it wasn't your time. And I've kept that with me for a long time. And Colonel Butler's son went in the State Department and became an ambassador. And I wrote an article about it, and before the magazine went in the tank, it was published. So he and his two sisters were very, very happy that I wrote. And I had some things that he'd said, which I wrote down in my little journal, which I kept daily on that tour.
What are some other things on Vietnam you would like to share?
I just think that, like I said, I was fortunate to see some of the best in America there, and with leadership, officers and non-commissioned officers who taught me so much. Every leader in combat makes mistakes. The important thing is you only make that mistake once. You don't make it twice. So I had some great non-commissioned officers, and they really helped me a lot. And as a matter of fact, when I was promoted to general, I sent them a picture because I was working in the Pentagon and had access to where they were. And I said, because what you taught me way back when, I am where I am today.
So when did you leave Vietnam? Was this 1973?
I got home in March of 1973. We had a date. The Paris Peace Accords set a date that 60 days after the signing, the last U.S. soldier had to be out of Vietnam. And I left about 7 or 8 days before that time. I was asked to close out and do some things and help out with some things that the CIA needed, and I did that, and then I came home.
After being in Vietnam twice, now you're back in the States. What was that like? You're still in the service?
Well, see, I'm still in the Army.
Yeah.
So I was, and matter of fact, I was supposed to I went to school at that time called the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. So everybody there had been to Vietnam. We were all majors, lieutenant colonels, and a few captains. We all had been to Vietnam, so, it was, we all had had similar experiences, and so, we were not exposed to other people that time. So we were in a cocoon. We always called it a magnificent ghetto that we were there. And, because we had very little interaction You know, we had some with the civilian community, but at Fort Leavenworth, it's a big post. You lived on post. You drank at the officers' club. And, you know, we would say we swill beer and chain smoked.
So what did you do for the rest of your career?
After that, after Leavenworth, I went to the recruiting command. And then I was selected to command an infantry battalion in the 25th Infantry Division. And after that, I went to the War College, and then I was selected to be an operations officer for the 7th Infantry Division. I was the ops officer, I was a brigade commander and the chief of staff of the division. And then I went to Washington to the Pentagon, my first tour in the Pentagon, as the executive assistant to the Army Vice Chief of Staff. And after that, I got promoted. I went to 10th Mountain Division as the Deputy Commanding General, and then I went to Pakistan as the U.S. Defense Rep. That was when Desert Storm started in '92. I was there in 1992. At that time, I had 2 kids in college, and I needed to make some money, and I retired from the Army.